Welcome to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church.
Hello, my name's David and I'm going to be reading from Judges chapter 19, and we looked at this chapter and the next chapter in our Bible study group, which meets on Wednesdays at 10 o'clock at our place. Judges chapter 19, I'm reading the first 20 verses. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servants and 2 donkeys. She took him into her parents' home, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay. So he stayed with him 3 more days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. On the 4th day they got up early and he prepared to leave, but the woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go." So the 2 of them sat down to eat and drink together. Afterward the woman's father said, "Please stay the night and enjoy yourself." And when the man got up to go, his father-in-law persuaded him, so he stayed there that night. On the morning of the 5th day, when he rose to go, the woman's father said, "Refresh yourself, wait till afternoon." So the 2 of them ate together. Then when the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the woman's father, said, "Look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day's nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way home." But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went toward Jebus, that's Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. When they were near Jebus and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night." His master replied, "No, we won't go into any city where the people are not Israelites. We'll go on to Gibeah." He added, "Come, let's try to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." So they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah in Benjamin. There they stopped to spend the night. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them in for the night. That evening an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the inhabitants of the place were Benjamites, came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw the traveller in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" He answered, "We're on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I've been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. No one's taken me in for the night. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for ourselves, your servants, me, the woman and the young man with us. We don't need anything." "You're welcome at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need, only don't spend the night in the square."
Well, good morning, everybody. Morning. I'll try that again. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. No excuse to be asleep. I haven't started yet. All right, I am going to start by reading the last part of Judges chapter 19 for us, where it gets awful. Remember, he's staying at Gibeah because this is Israel. This is not like one of those other pagan nations. And this is what happens. So the man took him into his house and fed his donkeys. After they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. And while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I'll bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. And they raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the days the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine. We must do something. So speak up." Well, how did we get here? Now, have you ever found yourself in a spot and just stop and think, "Oh, how on earth did I get here?" Now, I've done my fair share of bushwalking, and one time in the past when I was being paid to lead a group on a walk many years ago, I was leading a group and we found ourselves at a dead end. And we're facing a 10-foot retaining wall of somebody's property. And I thought to myself, uh-oh, this is bad. How did we get here? Or maybe you can remember a time in your life where it seems everything has just collapsed around you. Maybe literally, maybe figuratively. Maybe a time when you looked around at your life and you thought to yourself, this isn't what I'd planned. Whether it be in a relationship or your job or a hobby that's just consumed you, you can get to a point and ask yourself, how did I get here? I think this is the sensation I get at this point in the book of Judges. How did we get here? See, the last judge in the book of Judges was Samson. And he really showed everything that was wrong with Israel in verse 7 of chapter 14, because we get an insight into what the deeper problem was. You see, in this verse, his reason for wanting to marry a woman that he knows is against what God requires of him was literally that she is right in my eyes. This thing that is evil in God's eyes is right in Samson's own eyes. And here we see this played out in the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges. And this idea is really the context for chapters 19 and 20 that we're looking at today. But in the last 5 chapters in the book, there are no more judges. There is no pattern. There is no downward spiral that we saw at the start of the book because we've hit rock bottom. What is interesting is that there is no mention of what we have become used to. Yeah, that phrase, "and Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord." Instead, we get a different repeated phrase. "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And it's clear by what we read that what is good in their own eyes is actually evil in God's eyes. But can you see the change here? No longer are we looking from God's point of view. No longer are we seeing the actions of God's people through God's eyes. And no longer do we get God rescuing his people from their deserved judgment by sending a judge, because nobody is truly looking to God anyway. We are seeing this action from Israel's point of view, from their own eyes. They are doing what was right in their own eyes. Can you see here the people have taken the role that belongs to God? They have taken the role that belongs to God, which is basically the definition of sin. In those days, Israel had no king. They did what was right in their own eyes. So this phrase that we get a few times in these last 5 chapters was, "there was no king in Israel." Along with what takes place here in chapters 19 and 20, it's not making a political point that this country needed a better form of government. It's not making even an historical point that this country was not in the stage of history where they were ruled by a monarch, but rather it's making a theological point. These people have rejected God as their rightful king. And this little point might be more of a challenge for us than we might first realise, because the point is that God's people here are acting as if there is nobody ruling over them, there is nobody limiting their freedom, dictating what is right and wrong. And this might seem to us like a good thing. Self-determination, yeah? Total freedom from any authority who wants to oppress what I want to do. Master of our own destiny. That all sounds like the ultimate of all that is good in our society, doesn't it? Isn't that what our society wants us to value? One church member was telling me that when they were a teenager reading the book of Judges, and they read that there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, he thought this was perfect. Great, finally. Because he assumed that having a king was a bad thing, and that if only people had no king, they would do what was right and good if they could freely choose to act without being under some higher authority. He has since told me how wrong he was. But chapters 19 and 20, because they show us what can happen when you are accountable to nobody. When you're accountable only to yourself and what is right in your own eyes. So we can and we should look at these chapters and be completely disgusted, completely outraged at the horror of what happened. But we need to remember that our own temptation to want to be free of anybody else's authority, including God's, that sets us on a dangerous path that can lead absolutely anywhere. It can even lead to this absurd morality. How could anybody possibly justify to themselves anything that goes on in these chapters? I'll tell you how. One tiny step at a time. One small part at a time. It's like that old saying goes, and maybe you've heard this. How do you eat an elephant? Anybody know? One bite at a time, exactly. Hey, it's not just me who's heard that. But this is the same thing. One small step away from God at a time can lead you anywhere. Now, in these chapters, I don't think we can find a single character who we could look to as a hero or as a model for us. Nobody is righteous, not even one. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details again in a great detail what happened in chapter 19. To hear it once is enough for me. I'm guessing for you too. But I will take us through the repercussions that we see in chapter 20, which wasn't read out for us today. But again, in chapter 20, we're going to be asking ourselves, seriously, how did we get here? Now, I don't think you can read Judges chapter 19, the end of it, without remembering Genesis chapter 19, where Lot offers hospitality in the city of Sodom to two travellers, and he offers protection from a mob, who wanted to rape him. And I believe the writer of Judges specifically wants us to remember Sodom, because Gibeah in the book of Judges is the new Sodom. But it's even worse, because these are meant to be God's own people. And they are worse than the worst pagan city of Sodom. It's an example of total and extreme depravity. In fact, another prophet, Hosea, when he's trying to express a situation of total moral depravity and evil, says it's this way. He mentions the days of Gibeah. What we get in chapter 19 are the horrific events in the lives of these people. And what happens in chapter 20 shows how far, not just these people, but the whole nation of Israel has fallen. I mean, they respond to the disgusting method this detestable Levite has used to call them in a bigger way than any call from any spirit-filled judge that God has raised up for them. Look at verse 1 of chapter 20. Then all Israel from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came together as one and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. This is a bigger response than anything we've seen so far when God has righteously called them through a judge or a prophet. And yet this detestable Levite, in a detestable way, gets this kind of response. I think we're meant to be appalled. And then this massive assembly hears the account of the great evil that has occurred and rightly decides it needs to completely eradicate this evil from amongst them. But I've got to say, the way this Levite tells the story is completely sus. Have a look. He says in verse 4 to 7, So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, I and my concubine came to Gibeah in Benjamin to spend the night. And during the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine and she died. I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance because they committed this lewd and outrageous act in Israel. Now, all you Israelites, speak up and tell me what you have decided to do. Now, he remembers this story a little bit differently from the facts that were given, doesn't he? He paints himself as a real victim here. They were going to kill me. And what they had in mind wasn't exactly that. They raped my concubine, forgetting the fact that he sent her out to them to save himself. And my concubine died, leaving out the fact that she was still alive enough to make her way to his doorway, where he must have just been sound asleep, with no concern for her. And then he says what he did like he had no other choice. Now this is incredibly detestable. But you know what? It's so easy to shape half-truths to get what we want, isn't it? Especially when all that you do is what's right in your own eyes. We can all be tempted to shape the facts to make us look better, can't we? I know I've done that, and I suspect many of us have done that. I just don't think to this extent. But you know, we can't unhook these chapters from the previous two chapters either. Micah and Dan, they tried to manipulate God by having a Levite as their priest in their idolatry. They were doing what was right in their own eyes, and they were expecting God to be on their side. And in these chapters, we have the Levite manipulating God's people and expecting them to be on his side, which sadly he gets. And what we're going to see from here to the end of the book is that the only intervention from God is judgment on not just the tribe of Benjamin, who we're going to see prefer to stick up for the men of Gibeah rather than submit to God, but it's a judgment on all of Israel. The only grace and mercy we find is that God stays involved with his people and doesn't just wipe them off the face of the earth like he did with the original Sodom. So while this assembly, after this presentation, correctly sees the evil of Gibeah, this replica of Sodom, they didn't quite correctly see the character of this Levite. And the big assembly, in reality, is no solution to everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. I mean, a larger assembly should help, so that it's not just each individual doing what was right in their own eyes, but without God, there's no guarantee that a bigger group of individuals doing what was right in each of their own eyes is going to be a guarantee of getting it right. But in one sense, what they do next is partly right, because they ought to purge the evil from amongst them. That's what God had told them to do in the past. And this evil is as bad as it gets. But I have to wonder why they are so prepared to do to one of their own tribes what they failed to do to the enemies of God's people at the start of the book. In verse 11 we read, So all the Israelites got together and united against the city. And in verse 12 to 13, it seems like they're trying to do the right thing here. The tribes of Israel sent messengers throughout the tribe of Benjamin saying, What about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now turn those wicked men of Gibeah over to us so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel." So here we're thinking maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. But then we get the response from the tribe of Benjamin. But the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. From their towns they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. So instead of joining the nation to fight evil, they want to join the evil to fight the nation. I mean, they say blood is thicker than water, but surely their tribal commitment should not be thicker than the covenant with God that actually formed the tribe in the first place? Surely. How did we get here? God has been acting throughout the book of Judges through the despicable nations that are enemies of God. But now the despicable people of God are the ones in that role who are going to be bringing judgment on themselves in chapter 20. The unfolding drama in chapter 20, where thousands of lives are lost on both sides of this civil war, I think shows us that God is not only using Israel to punish the evil of the Benjamites, but using the conflict to punish all of Israel for their neglect of him. Yes, as the story goes on, they seem to inquire of the Lord, but they're not really wanted to listen. They only want the Lord to rubber stamp their decisions to begin with. They don't ask God if this is right to attack the whole tribe of Benjamin, if this is right in his eyes. They begin by saying, "Oh, so who are we going to send first to do this thing that's right in our eyes?" But at this point, I have a bit of sympathy, because in one sense, I get it. I get what they're trying to do. I know my own heart, and when I hear of domestic violence, I want to drag the bloke to the car park. But I don't have the authority to do that. That's not my job as much as I wish it was. So I understand what the Israelites are doing here. Who are you going to send first, God? Because we've got to get these guys. It's not until they have actually lost a battle, 2 battles, that they actually do what they were supposed to do under their covenant relationship with God. In verse 26, they finally acknowledge who God is and the right way to approach him. And they ask to look through his eyes. And only then does the war come to an end. Now, the whole 2 chapters are tragic and detestable. How did we get here? But as I've been looking through these things, one of the shocking things that I uncovered was that it didn't take 300 years for them to get to this point. Having this account at the end of the book makes us think that it was a long time before things got so bad, but apparently the real shocking thing, apart from the absolute horror of God's people behaving in a way that's worse than the people of Sodom, is that in reality, this was just within 1 generation from the death of Joshua. The steps they took away from God, even if they were just small steps, led to the bottom of this downward spiral very quickly. So I'm left wondering, as I suspect many of us are, why on earth has God included these chapters in his word? Dave mentioned earlier some of the reasons, and I think if we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we can see some as well. But I've been poring over these chapters in depth for many weeks now, and I'm still not completely sure. I'm still sickened by them. In fact, the more you delve into them, the more details you uncover and the worse they make you feel. But then I had a few thoughts. Maybe the account of what happened here is to show how horrific it can get when we reject God and only feel the need to do what is right in our own eyes. To show that maybe it's here to show that to get to so far down the spiral, to get so far away from God, happens with just a lot of small steps. These small steps without any thought to the way God says we should walk. Small steps off his path. But I confess I still wish that this wasn't here. It's too disturbing, and I certainly wish I wasn't the one who was asked to preach it. But then I thought, why do I feel this way? Maybe because I don't like to be disturbed. I prefer to be happy. Maybe this is here to slap us in the face, to jolt us awake to the reality of human suffering here and now, in our society, in our day and age, because we're pretty good at just ignoring things that disturb us, just putting them out of our mind so we can be comfortable. The injustice in our world, the poor, the lonely, the profoundly physically or mentally ill, the homeless, the victims of abuse, even the fact that Christian people are perpetrators of abuse. All these people made in the image of God, living in situations that should rightly disturb us. We prefer to ignore them, to lock ourselves inside our own protected world and get a good night's sleep. Maybe the challenge for us is to see people through God's eyes instead of our own. Open our eyes to the evil that is going on here and now. Listen to the stories of people who are suffering. Cry with them. Pray. Do good where we are able, but not just continually look away because it makes us uncomfortable. We ought to remember them. We ought to see them, hear them. We ought to seek justice. And another thing, in the book of Judges, the treatment of women in particular, as well as each other in general, gets progressively worse as the book goes on. It goes from encouraging women to make decisions about property in chapter 1, giving them honour in chapter 4, to using them as a means of harming others, as in the case of Samson, or to offering them as sacrifices in the case of Jephthah, to allowing them to be brutally treated like this in chapter 19. So we shouldn't read this chapter and think that God is okay with this behaviour. He is absolutely opposed to any form of mistreatment of any human being, but particularly the vulnerable, which is one of the reasons Sodom was under his judgment. We are meant to see that Israel deserves the judgment of God here. In fact, God in his word is particularly concerned to show us that the cries of the weak, the oppressed, the vulnerable, they are heard by him. And we need to understand that more than just a human king is needed to make sure that perfect justice is given. Now again, I'll add to Dave's words earlier. If what we've seen today in the book of Judges has, triggered something for you, then please speak up. Seek help, because you are not alone. God may seem absent. His people may not seem to want to see or hear you, but you are not alone. There are even a number of resources in the handouts this morning. Please make use of any support that we can offer. But how did we get here? It is truly awful, but this is the end point of a complete rejection of God. A complete rejection of his authority and of his judgment of what is right and wrong. Like I said, you've got to read it in context of the last two chapters as well, because the previous two chapters saw horrific idolatry, and these two chapters see horrific immorality. I think we're meant to see that these two things go hand in hand. A rejection of God and how he says we ought to relate to him will eventually include a rejection of the way he says is how we ought to relate to one another. Idolatry will always eventually lead to immorality. And without Jesus, there is no antidote to this downward slide. Jesus, who was brutally beaten, rejected by his own people, who suffered the full wrath of God for all the sin and injustice of the world, who paid with his life for each and every injustice and evil act in full, even though he was completely innocent. Jesus knows and understands and hears the pain and the cries of all who suffer. But Jesus was raised to the right hand of God and has been given the right to judge justly. So as God's King and Judge and as our Saviour, Jesus restores our relationship with God and works in us through his Spirit to renew our relationships with one another. God's forgiveness of our sin ought to change the way we treat one another with grace and mercy. In the end, Jesus is the only one who can rescue a humanity who much prefers to do what is right in our own eyes. My prayer today is that each one of us would humbly seek Jesus daily and would humbly ask for his help to walk in his ways. Amen.
You have been listening to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church. If you'd like to know more about Jesus, get further information, or download other resources, please visit our website at lmap.org.au.